Right, so we are picking up our series today, looking at the Book of Nehemiah. I will never get bored of that graphic. Looks fantastic. Gotta love those sort of things. And the title of our series is Time to Build. Time to Build. And as I mentioned earlier on, this morning, the topic isn't about conflict amongst our family, but actually how do we fight together? How do we work together as His people to achieve vision and to achieve what God has set out for us to do as His people? And you will have gathered from Ed earlier on that we're right in the middle of a 30 days in September of really pushing into prayer and vision for what God has for us as a church. And one of the things we really feel is at this time that there is a call for us to kind of raise our spiritual temperature, to be people who seek and push into God in prayer and look to hear what it is that He is saying for us in this phase of our church life as our time together. And so we feel very kind of provoked to do that in these 30 days, not to be people who are comfortable and settled in our place in life, but to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable, to allow ourselves to move away from any sense of complacency and to go deeper in our discipleship, deeper in our relationships with one another, deeper in our sense of mission for all that God has given us to do. And so we want to both enjoy our life together, but also to push forward, to step into all that God has got for us. And so you would have heard earlier on, Ed was talking about things like the prayer diary, opportunities like the 24/7 prayer room throughout September, that you can come any time of the day or night, just to spend time in God's presence, to seek Him, to pray and to listen to what He's saying for us. And of course also those Monday nights, 8 till 9 o'clock here in this building, to spend time with one another, praying and worshipping God. So if you don't feel quite yet as if you've kind of made the most of that as an opportunity, I would invite you to take part in this special time we have together in September. And if you were here last week, you would have heard Ed speak in the first part of our series looking at the Book of Nehemiah. And he gave this kind of fancy graphic, which again I've stolen too, because I think it makes me very excited. Thinking about the Book of Nehemiah and where it fits in the story. And very much by way of historical recap, if you like, the Book of Nehemiah is a story of a man who had vision, who through lots of prayer and in the face of plenty of opposition was someone who executed that vision in his time and in his day. He lived in a time where God's people had, in many ways, lost hope. They'd lost hope. In the midst of really difficult circumstances, God used Nehemiah and indeed God's people to achieve something that no one thought could happen. There was just too many barriers to seeing the temple walls rebuilt, and yet God used this, very ordinary guy, Nehemiah, to do some extraordinary things for him. And so what we have got here in this map is 3 areas: Jerusalem, Babylon, and Susa. And Jerusalem, back in 587 BC, had found itself squeezed by the great empire of the Babylonians. And in a series of attacks on the city of Jerusalem, 3 or so major attacks on that city, what we find is after that third attack, that final time, the city is destroyed and the walls of the city of Jerusalem are broken down. And it's hard for us to get our heads around this, but this was a cataclysmic event for God's people. for their capital city, for the place where, particularly that temple where they view God as dwelling with his people, that touch point between heaven and earth, for that temple to be destroyed and the walls of the city to come down was massive. For the people of Jerusalem and for Jews more wider, they saw in many ways this not being just the tearing down of physical walls in that city, but the tearing down of their sense of identity, their sense of significance as God's people. And what they found was, that sense of identity was left in rubble. And yet, perhaps 50 years later, this great empire of Babylon is replaced by the Persian Empire, which reigned for about 200 years or so, and at the time was the biggest, strongest empire of the world. And it was under these Persians that the Jews have an opportunity to start rebuilding Jerusalem. And what we see, under Zerubbabel and Ezra, and then also under Nehemiah, is God raises up people to go back to the city of Jerusalem and begin rebuilding. First under Zerubbabel, the temple, and with Ezra and Nehemiah, the walls of the city. And if you can read all about it, it's all in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Originally, Ezra and Nehemiah, as two books in our Bible, was originally one book. It was one story. And you can read right through about how God uses those people to rebuild the temple and also rebuild the walls around Jerusalem. And so this morning, we're picking up on the story in chapter 3 of Nehemiah. And, if you read your Bibles regularly, you might do kind of Bible in a year, or you might, read through books of the Bible in your own sort of devotions. I wonder for you whether this is one of those passages that kind of washes over you a little bit and you don't give an awful lot of thought to. If you've already read ahead, you'll find that it reads a bit like a cross between a genealogy and an audio description of an ordnance survey map. Right? That's a bit like what it is this morning. I must admit, when I first read it, I saw all of the polysyllabic Hebrew names, and my first thought was, right, who can I get to read this one out for me? Because I'm going to struggle. And then I thought, no, I've got to take one for the team. So I'm going to try and pronounce them all myself, and we'll see how I get on with that in a few minutes. One of the things I did about a month ago in mild panic looking at this passage was to go on Amazon. And you go on Amazon and you search for commentaries, which are kind of basically books about books of the Bible, looking to help us to unpack and understand what those books mean. And I was kind of searching for, what are some of the best commentaries on the Book of Nehemiah? And apparently one of the best-selling commentaries on the Book of Nehemiah is by a fantastic pastor and teacher in the States called Chuck Swindoll. And the book's called Hand Me Another Brick. And the sort of subtitle of the book is Timeless Leadership Lessons from Nehemiah. And I thought, that looks fantastic. And if you're familiar with Amazon, you click on that little link that says look inside. You click on that link, look inside, and it kind of shows you the first few pages and perhaps, the first sort of 10 pages or so of the first chapter of the book, and it shows you the contents page and stuff. And so I read that, and I looked at chapter 1, and I thought, this looks, fantastic, really good stuff. Turn over, look at the contents page, right? Chapter 2, really, really helpful stuff. Chapter 4, Oh, hang on a minute. Where's chapter 3? This guy misses out chapter 3 entirely from his commentary, which blessed me in that moment, I've got to say. So maybe, as I've sort of spent the last month or so thinking about this passage, actually, I feel the Lord's been speaking to me really clearly, actually, about, just what a great passage this is for us to unpack this morning. And actually, there is an awful lot there. I wonder whether Chuck, when he comes to his revised version, might think again. I don't think he'll watch this talk, but we'll see. We'll see how that goes. It's a remarkable window into a group of Again, very ordinary people who accomplished something amazing. And so let's read together. Nehemiah chapter 3. If you've got your Bibles, you might like to turn with me to that. It's also on the screens in front of us here. So let's read Nehemiah chapter 3. And I'm glad I'm wearing my contact lenses this morning for this one. So Eliashib, the high priest, and his fellow priests went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. They dedicated it and set its doors in place, building as far as the Tower of the 100, which they dedicated, and as far as the Tower of Hananel. The men of Jericho built the adjoining section, and Zakur, son of Imri, built next to him. The fish gate was rebuilt by the sons of Hassaniah. They laid its beams and put its doors and bolts and bars in place. Meremoth, son of Uriah, the son of Hakoz, repaired the next section, and next to him, Meshullam, son of Berechiah. How could I not remember that? The son of Meshazabel made repairs, and next to him, Zadok, son of Bana, also made repairs. The next section was repaired by the men of Tekoa, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. The Jashanah gate was repaired by Joadiah, son of Paseah, and Meshullam, son of Besoadiah. You're going to give me a clap at the end of this, aren't you? Please do. Next to him, repairs were made by men from Gibeon and Mizpah, Melatiah, thank you, and of Gibeon, and Jadon of Merinoth, places under authority of the governor of the Trans-Euphrates. Uzziel, son of one of the goldsmiths. He was one of the goldsmiths, didn't you know? He repaired the next section, and Hananiah, one of the perfume makers, made repairs next to that. They restored Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Rephaiah, son of Hur, ruler of the half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section. And adjoining this, Jediah, son of Haramathah, made repairs opposite his house, and Hattush, son of Hashabaniah, made repairs next to him. Malchijah, son of Harim, I was going to memorize this, but and Hashub, son of Parathah, Moab, repaired another section and the Tower of the Ovens. Shalom, son of Halohesh, ruler of the half-district of Jerusalem, repaired the next section with the help of his daughters. And the valley gate was repaired by Hanun and the residents of Zanoah. They rebuilt it and put its doors and their bolts and bars in place. They also repaired 1,000 cubits of the wall as far as the dung gate. The dung gate, which is as it sounds, was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem. He rebuilt it and put its doors and their bolts and bars in place. Thank you. I could keep going for another 18 verses. I could. You know what we... Careful. You know, what we see here is, I described it earlier on as an audio guide to an ordnance survey map. And that, you know, very much is a bit like what's going on here. If you could just put up that little map of Jerusalem, thank you. We got here, if you just look, now you won't be able to make out any of this detail. But actually, as you read through this chapter, what you see is right in the top of, what you see here is the walls that Nehemiah is rebuilding, is the green bit, okay? This is Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day. And he is here describing the rebuilding of the walls. And he's starting at the top, at the sheep gate, and working his way around anti-clockwise. And actually, you can follow this round, if you're so inclined to do. I have. You can follow this round anti-clockwise and read through the chapter and see each of the different groups, each of the different tribes, each of the different clans and peoples rebuilding each section of that wall. And so he goes round. What is it we can possibly learn from this passage, and how do we apply it to our lives? Well, actually, I think there's an incredible amount. The first thing I want us to do is to see how all God's people step up to the task. How they step up to the task. If you can move me on, Graham, to the step up. Thank you. We see here, under the vision set by Nehemiah to rebuild the walls, everyone grabs a shovel. Everyone gets their hands dirty. I think it's really significant here that the first person we read about in this chapter is this chap called Eliashib. He was the high priest. He was, if you like, the chief religious official of his day. And he, it says in our passage, he rolls up his sleeves effectively. He, as in verse 1 says, went to work and rebuilt the sheep gate. He rolled up his sleeves and got his hands dirty. I'm sure he had lots of very important things to be doing. But here, with the vision of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, he puts aside his importance and he rolls up his sleeves and gets involved. Now, much to my wife's dismay, I love buying books. You might have gathered this already. I love to always find a new book that I can add both to my reading list but also to my bookshelf. And I was listening to a great talk yesterday by a chap called Tim Hughes up in Gas Street Church in Birmingham. And he drew my attention to another book that I've just added to my list of books to read. Because over the summer, he'd been reading a book by a guy called Jonathan Sacks. And if you've not heard of Jonathan Sacks, he is formerly the chief rabbi in the UK. And he's written a fantastic book, by the sounds of things, called Lessons in Leadership. And he's looking at the first 4 books of the Bible. And what he asks is, what is it we can learn about leadership from these books? And he says something I think really helpful. He says, essentially leadership is people standing up and taking responsibility. Leadership is standing up and taking responsibility. Taking responsibility when a situation looks desperate, when the problems look grave, when it looks like it can't be done. A leader is someone who stands up and says, I'm willing to pay the cost. I'm willing to give it my best. There's someone who chooses not to be a critic and to point the finger, to highlight all the problems. Especially today with all politics and everything going on in this country, it can be very easy for us to sit back in our armchairs, feel like we know best, and point the finger at others. We know exactly what needs to be done, or perhaps we don't. But actually, the far more difficult thing is for us to be willing to get our hands dirty, to be willing to step up and to be part of the solution to the issues of our day. And the first challenge, I think, from this passage around stepping up is this. If not you, then who? If not you, then who? If you aren't going to step up, aren't going to take responsibility for the situations you find yourself in, the culture in your office, perhaps the atmosphere at the school gate and the conversations that are had there, the environment we find ourselves in our community and our neighbourhood, the sense of responsibility we need for our community and the well-being of others, for community within these walls, for us as his people, as his church, then who is going to do it? We all want to be part of a church where we see deep community. We all want to be part of a church that's welcoming. We all want to be part of a church where people find and are integrated into the family, who find life and healing and wholeness. A place where people encounter Jesus. A place where we're encouraging one another to pursue him with everything that we have got. We long to see that, don't we? I do. We long to see that. But what that takes is each one of us, not looking to the person next to them, but choosing to roll up our sleeves, choose to be people who say, if not me, then who's going to do it? I'm going to choose to step up and to step into all that God is calling us to be as his people. Loving people, welcoming people, people who serve, people who have the courage to invite others along, to see God move in our community. I think God is looking for people who will step forward and say, I want to be a part of the solution. I want to be part of the solution. And so this is why I think Rabbi Sachs picks up on a really important point here. If we're going to be people who are leaders, and I think we are all leaders. You're a leader in your family. You're a leader in your workplace. You're a leader amongst your friends. We're to be people who take responsibility and don't shirk it. Take responsibility and not shirk it. And what we see in this passage is a whole bunch of people, men and women, from different towns and different cities. You've got people who come and help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem who are not Jerusalemites. They're not from Jerusalem. They're from other places. But they go and they say, I'm going to be part of this. I'm going to help to rebuild the walls. You see people who are tradespeople, people who are merchants. You see perfumers and goldsmiths. You see priests and temple servants and Levites. Everyone gets involved. So we've got an incredible list of people here who do not shrink from the task. But there's one exception. You may have noticed as we read through, I'll forgive you if you didn't, verse 5 here. The people of Tekoa had what's described in the NIV as a group of nobles. And it says in verse 5, their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work under their supervisors. If you read in another translation, in the English Standard Version, it says that their nobles would not stoop to serve the Lord. That's a really interesting phrase, isn't it? It says that, a particular section of the wall was repaired by these Tekoites, but these nobles wouldn't get involved. They would be the only people who wouldn't find their place in what God was doing in their time. They can't see beyond their own kind of sense of self-importance. You've heard the phrase stiff-necked. This is where that kind of thing comes from. These people would not stoop to do the work. Their posture should have been that of obedience to God and of rolling up their sleeves and getting involved. But instead, their pride holds them back. These nobles didn't want to get dirt under their fingernails. And what a tragic one-liner that is to have recorded. Amongst all these list of names of amazing people who served God in their day in very, very practical ways, this group of nobles stands out. The most important thing for us isn't our ability, but our availability. What we see here is a group of people who are willing to be available. And these Tekoite nobles stand out as choosing to not be available because they had more important things to do. Are you available? It doesn't matter what you do or what skills you feel like you have or you don't have. God is looking for people who want to serve him, who want to get involved. Nobody's above doing the hard work for God. And this high priest in verse 1, Eliashib, he sets the example. People are looking at you. People are looking at me. And people are bent towards looking for examples of how to live their lives, for looking at how other people do things? Are you going to be someone who steps up to the task? I wonder if there's an area in your life where you are stepping back when God is telling you to step up to the plate, step up to what he has for you and how he would have you live. And so here we have an amazing example of people who step up, but they are also people who step out. They step out. In the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls, we see a vast diversity of different roles and different people who get involved. You know, we read earlier on about the goldsmiths and the perfume makers. You know, I can't imagine these perfumers quite kind of fitting in with the kind of builder types. Can you? I'm not sure. Maybe. Maybe it's a bit unfair of me. But they grabbed a shovel anyway. They probably smelt good doing it, but they grabbed a shovel anyway. And there were priests here whose regular work was nothing like this, building walls. But they rolled up their sleeves. They considered their normal jobs to be irrelevant, and they got on with this building project. We read in this passage of administrators and overseers, and they didn't use their day-to-day work as an excuse to avoid getting their trowels out. There were people here from different cities, from Jericho, from Tekoa, and they didn't use the fact that they weren't from Jerusalem as an excuse to get involved and to serve. There were men and there were women, and they all chose to get involved. Here's a challenge. I bet it was pretty uncomfortable for many of these people to step outside of what they saw themselves as good at, to do what God was asking them to do. To step out of what they saw themselves was good at, to do what God was asking them to do. You know, these group of Jews choose to step outside of their day-to-day roles, be they priests, be they goldsmiths, be they merchants, and they choose to get on with what God is asking them to do. And for many of them, I bet that was a fairly uncomfortable place to be. You know, there are times when God calls us to serve in ways that are outside of our giftedness. Don't let your perception of what you can do hold you back from doing what God is asking of you. You know, just like that boy, do you remember, who has the loaves and the fish? And he brings them to Jesus with the disciples. And it's all that these 5,000 have got. And this boy just brings what he's got. And Jesus takes that and he does something incredible with it. You know, remember the story of Moses. And Moses God looks at Moses and he says, "What's in your hand?" Exodus 4, you know, what's in your hand? And what's Moses got in his hand? It's just a staff. It's just a shepherd's staff. It's nothing. It's just my job. It's nothing important. But God uses that to bless others. It may be that what you feel is in your hand is of importance. And yet this morning, I'd also encourage you to say, "But God, I'm willing to put that aside to do what it is that you want me to do." It may be that what's in your hand you feel is of no importance whatsoever. And God asks you this morning to say, "Give it to me anyway. Give me your availability. Give me yourself." And so, you know, many of us will know that, and you can just see as I look around me now, we're busy here on a Sunday morning, aren't we? There's lots going on. And, you know, you'll know that we're progressing plans to extend this building and to make room for more people in this space. You know, we don't want anyone to come in as a guest here and look around and think, "Oh, there's obviously no place for me. There's no seat for me. There's no place for me to fit." Now, as I talk a little bit about the building, what I'm not necessarily saying is that we're all going to pick up our shovels and start knocking down walls and building things. Necessarily, you never know. But what I am saying is actually we all have our part to play in building church. And by church, I don't mean the physical walls of this building. I mean the church, the people. For those of us who already call Highgrove home, and for those of us who are yet to come, we want to invest in the next step in securing a larger space here that would sustain and facilitate our ministry in this community for many, many years to come. And if we together are going to impact our community for Jesus, then it's going to require all of us to step up and to step out into what God has for us. The thing about vision is that achieving it usually involves stepping out of our settled place, stepping out of our comfort zones, if you like. It's natural and it's healthy for us to be in a position where if God doesn't show up, we're pretty stuffed. Growth will involve some pain for us. But I'd ask you again that question this morning. Are you putting yourself in a position regularly where you are uncomfortable? Where actually you're stepping beyond what you feel you are able to do? Because I believe it's in that place where God does great things. It's in that place where God really uses us. And so as we progress plans for this building, in due course, there'll be opportunities for you to step out in that. There'll be opportunities to give towards the extension of this facility to serve God in our community. But there'll be many, many more opportunities for us to get involved and to serve and to work together as we progress plans for our community. So the last thing, step up, step out, but also step together. You may well have picked up as we read through the phrase, next to him, next to him, next to him, or next to them. And that phrase throughout this chapter is mentioned 21 times. I counted them. This is an amazing feat here of organisation and of concerted action by God's people. Nehemiah, the leader, isn't mentioned a single time in this chapter. There is a Nehemiah mentioned before any of you eagle-eyed people see in verse 16, but it's a different Nehemiah. Nehemiah is not mentioned. God's people here work together to achieve a common vision. And so these different groups set out to work on the adjacent stretches of the wall. What we see here is God's people working together. And that's a challenge to us, especially in our culture that so highly values the individual and individuals' choices and control over their lives, or perceived control. So many of us are trained to think of ourselves as independent entities with our own set of choices, with our own, if you like, with commitment to church, fitting in just alongside many other competing priorities and commitments in our life. And yet what we see here is a bunch of people who step out together to serve. I wonder for us how we're getting on stepping together. Because if you in your life are seeking to step outside of comfort into discomfort, taking steps of faith, finding yourself serving God in new ways that make you feel kind of a little bit on edge, one of the things that will really help us all is if we're doing that together, where we have a culture of challenge of one another to serve him as his people. And there's many ways in which we can move forward together. But I'd encourage you, if you're not part of some smaller group within church life here, I'd encourage you to think seriously about that. That might just involve a time where you regularly meet up with a couple of other people to pray and to encourage one another, to seek God together. There's many people in this church who meet together in kind of prayer triplets and things like that. There's lots of people that meet together in small groups to encourage and support one another. There's many people here who choose to make themselves accountable to others. Maybe just to one other person that you're meeting with regularly, to be open and to be honest and to help you to be a better disciple of Jesus. I'd encourage you this morning, you may find yourself thinking, I don't know how I step together with God's people. I'd encourage you to be thinking about how that happens for you. So a fantastic passage, actually. You might want to read it at bedtime. Think about how we can step up, how we can step out, but also how we step together as his people to serve him. Spirit of the living God, we ask now that you would fall afresh on us. I pray, Lord, that you would breathe into each of us your life-giving spirit. And as we spend time now worshipping you, I pray, Lord, for those who this morning just want to respond to what you're saying. Almost as a sign again to bring what's in our hands and to give it to you. A sense of recommissioning of our lives to serve and love you together as your people. Just as that little boy brought his loaves and his fish to Jesus, and Jesus did something incredible. Lord, I pray, Lord, that just we would come as ourselves, with all our fears and all of our failures, with all of our successes and all of our achievements, and we lay that before you, God, and say, we are available. We are open to you. We long for more of you. We hunger for more of your life, more of your spirit to be working through us to reach a world so desperately in need. In Jesus' name, amen.